Yeah, 50 years is almost incomprehensible. I was a teenager at the time that I met Richard. He had a recent graduate of William and Marion teaching here in Loudoun County. And half a century for all of us is pretty extraordinary. I mean, there's very few of us in here that weren't here in 1976 in remembering the 200th anniversary. So it's, I guess for all of us, we could say we're happy we're here 50 years later. And my goodness, we've seen so many changes in those 50 years, and we continue to change. Of course, that's what human beings are. If we don't evolve, then we should die. So we are a constant experiment in evolution. Good, bad, ugly, beautiful, whatever we may be, we constantly are evolving. And so I'm really glad to be able here to share this with you. Part of my evolution, incidentally, I feel somewhat self-conscious, and I almost canceled this event. I didn't do that because of Ed and Richard, but I just lost 2 front teeth, and that was a surprise. I have never had a cavity, and I've really never had any dental oral issue whatsoever, but they're gone right now. And so bear with me, and my tongue might get twisted now and then because it's not hitting where it's supposed to hit with the teeth, and a word might come out that may not come out. We'll all regret later on, but I apologize for for the absence of the teeth. I've been assured new ones are on the way, which is good to know. I will be fully restored at some point, and we'll have a good Frye smile once again. But thanks for bearing with me today as I feel a bit empty, a bit void up there, at least not up here, but at least right there. So we'll see how that works. It's always great to be back in Loudoun County for me because this is my home, as I think most of you know. I wasn't born here, but my father was. The Frye family has been a name in Loudoun County for a long time. You go to Lutheran Church outside of town, you'll find the Fryes, a lot of them.
The name most prevalent.
Oh, is it Frye?
In the cemetery.
In the cemetery. Okay. Yeah. And of course, my grandmother, my grandfather, Frye are buried there. And you know, it's interesting, the bulk of the names are FRY. And of course, my particular line is the German Fryes versus the English, which were always the FRYE. I remember when I was at Shepherd in my junior, because I'm a history major, I had to take a foreign language. Well, they offered German. My undergraduate school that offered German, and my German teacher had been in Germany all of World War II. So for me, every time I went in to speak with her, it was like a living history lesson where she was the real living history. So it was an extraordinary 2 years of German language opportunities for me. But I remember early on, she showed me a word, F-R-E-I. I think this might have been on the second day I was in the class. She said, I'd like to show this word to you, F-R-E-I. And I was still learning how to pronounce things at that time. And she said, this is Frye in German. This is how it's spelled. And I said, oh, how cool is that? That's the way it really was before we even came over here and somebody made it F-R-Y. And then she said, oh, you'll like this even better. The translation is free. F-R-E-I, Frye, German, free. What a great last name. So I really appreciate always coming back here to Loudoun County and literally feeling the depth of my roots. My family arrived here right around the time of the Revolution, so 250 years ago now. The classic into Philadelphia and down the Philadelphia wagon trail and ending up here in Loudoun County. My granddaddy Frye, Harry Frye, was the first real Frye to leave. He went across the river into Maryland and during the Depression, got a really good job working for Fairchild. And of course, working for Fairchild during World War II, that was a good place to be. When Fairchild had the massive plants there in Hagerstown. And so that's where my family is all based today. My father, John Frye, is still living. He's 91.5 years old now. So we have some genes that live for a while. And I'm hoping that I'll be around to be able to do future lectures over here in Loudoun County. You know, the other thing I want to share with you, I just mentioned my father, is actually two Johns. Before I go to John Frye, I want to mention John Devine. Many of you might remember John Devine. John's nickname was the Oracle of Loudoun County. And he earned that. That wasn't given to him. John earned that. John Devine was a phenomenal person, first of all, a caring, gentle, loving person, but very giving. And he especially loved to give anything that associated with Loudoun County history. And so he was a great, great student he was a scholar of Loudoun County history. And one of my earliest memories, John Devine was an active member of the Hagerstown Civil War Roundtable. And that was the only roundtable in this area at that time. A group of people that would get together, not around a round table, but that was the concept. And meet once a month. Richard and I were members of the Hagerstown Roundtable, and John would come up with a contingent of Loudoun County residents every month to be part of the Hagerstown Roundtable. So I'm a kid and a teenager when I got to know John Devine. And John Mosby had an attraction to me because the first, I'll call it adult Civil War book, one that wasn't a picture book like the American Heritage picture book that so many of us in the 1960s grew up on, looking at the American Civil War. I mean, I remember that book really well, but I related that because I couldn't read. I mean, I was visually trying to understand things through photographs and images. But as I began to develop my skills as a reader, the first adult or senior level Civil War book that was ever given to me from my father, who had a big collection, a big library, was Ranger Mosby, written by Virgil Carrington, Pat Jones. I'm in the 4th grade, so I'm 10 years old. And that book I read. Now, there was a lot of words in there I didn't understand. I didn't care. I didn't need to know. I didn't need to understand the words, because what I understood was the drama. I understood the drama of Mosby. And I captured, I mean, Pat Jones was so good using words. He was a professional journalist, as so many of these excellent, Bruce Catton as a professional journalist. So many of these earlier Civil War writers of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, that was their field. So they were able to take history and then convey it through their superb skills as artists, as writers. And that's what Pat Jones was able to do. And so I distinctly remember that book, but it got even better because since John Frye, Dad, was a native of Loudoun County, we would come over here to visit family. And the roads were still dirt. How cool was that? Yeah, they still are. I love it. I do tours in Loudoun County and purposely take people on dirt roads. Like, what is this? A dirt road in Virginia, in Loudoun County? Yeah, we still have them, of course. And so it was just very exciting to see all that dust. I mean, where I grew up in Washington County, Maryland, we're just across the river from you. We didn't have dirt roads in Washington County in 1960s, but here we still did. And that was that added to the drama, that added to the theater, because those were Mosby's roads. I mean, the roads that I was traveling with my father in the 1960s had not changed, except that it was different dust. That's really the only change. And so, that to have that experience as a kid, that foundational experience of history, we like to use the term the power of place. That was it. The power of Loudoun County and those roads, and to see the houses, the historic houses, the safe houses, you know, some of these places. And so then I was still in high school, and I asked John Devine one night at a Hagerstown Roundtable meeting, I said, John, would you give me a personal tour of Mosby's Confederacy? And he did. John was very pleased that as a young person, I was interested in history, and he did a lot to promote my interest in history and to elevate it even beyond. And so I remember getting in John's Cadillac, and if some of you knew John, you remember John's Cadillac. And we traveled all over Mosby country in Loudoun and Faulkner County, and went to places like Miskel's Farm when it was still Miskel's Farm. Well, it's not anymore, of course. I mean, most of Loudoun County's not anymore. Little editorial there. You know, so it really was this incredible experience of being with John, who was a descendant of both Union and Confederate veterans, one who fought, you know, with the North, one who fought with the South, and fought against each other in nearby Waterford. Just that experience, the Civil War, what I'm trying to suggest to you, here in Loudoun County, is not that far away. You know, we're talking about 250 years, but the Civil War still lives. I mean, it's in us. We're going to be commemorating, celebrating, remembering 250 years, as we should. But the emotional ties that we have is not to that war. Is not to that period. Because that period was overlapped, flooded by a much more personal and destructive period, where we basically were trying to destroy ourselves. I mean, let's face it, the Civil War is nothing but self-annihilation. We are killing ourselves. Don't try to sugarcoat it. We are bringing about our own destruction. Because we couldn't compromise, we couldn't agree, we couldn't settle, we couldn't talk to each other anymore, we couldn't respect each other anymore. And so it results in us killing each other by the hundreds of thousands. And that's what John Mosby, that's why he's famous. John Mosby's famous because we were in a war where we were killing each other. John Mosby is famous because his job as a Virginian is to kill Pennsylvanians. Or if we don't kill them, let's capture them, and then we'll send them to Andersonville, where they will die. Or let's hang them. Mosby's men will be hanged, and he will seek retribution. That's not America, people. That's not who we are. This is not who we are. That's who we were. And John Mosby is a product of that, who we were. So that's nothing to be proud of. Yet when we think of Mosby, a word that often comes to mind is pride. Mosby was here to defend you here in Loudoun County. Mosby was here to protect you here in Loudoun County. Mosby was here literally as your law and your lawyer here in Loudoun County. This is who Mosby was. He was who you depended upon. While the enemy occupied you, held you, strangled you. And so Mosby is as close to divinity from 1863 to 1865 as the Lord himself. In fact, even closer, because you might see Mosby, you never saw the Lord. Or if you didn't see Mosby, you would see one of his men. You might be one. Or if you didn't see him, you may be sheltering one of his men. Or you may be a parent of one of his men, or an aunt or an uncle or a cousin of one of his men. Because you're in the heart of Mosby's Confederacy. So, in search of Mosby's cave, I've never done this talk. I mean, it's very seldom that a group hears me do something the first time. And this was inspired by something that happened several months ago. I was contacted by Hollywood, which happens on occasion, because they like to think I know something about the Civil War. And I've been very, I guess the word would be blessed, to have a lot of national attention on national television. And so somehow these people find me, and I get this call out of the blue from a show called The Unexplained. Some of you are familiar with The Unexplained. That's with an X. Unexplained. William Shatner is the executive on this show, the executive producer of this show. Captain Kirk. I was kind of impressed that someone associated with Captain Kirk was actually contacted me. That's Hollywood never impresses me with that particular outreach. In fact, they invited me to come to LA to film with a little enticement that way you might meet William Shatner. That was not enough enticement for me to go to LA. And I told him, unless you figured out how to transport me the way you transported him, I'll try. But anyway, they showed up and they came here and filmed me in Washington, downtown Washington. And it was all about this myth, or this concept of two things. Two things. One dealt with a prize of war, a literal prize of war. And the other dealt with, where is it? What happened to it? Where did it go? So as we move through this, and this won't take long, I'll tell you about what it is they were looking for. And we've been searching for, apparently, for a long time. But I'm not going to start with the cave. I'm going to start with a raid. And you're familiar with it. It by far is Mosby's most famous exploit. In fact, today is pretty important. I was really excited about being able to speak today because this just happened last night. Last night, Mosby captured the general. Last night. Now, this is what you call serendipitous.
Captain Kirk working for you.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, last night in Fairfax Courthouse, and I'm not going to recount much of the story because you know it, but Mosby nabbed the general asleep. And it became a very famous exploit. General Stoughton. Well, is it Stoughton or Stout?
Stoughton.
Is it Stoughton? Stoughton.
I got named by one of his descendants.
Okay, it is Stoughton. All right, General Stoughton. Edwin Henry Stoughton. A very handsome man, actually. He is photographed. He's very attractive. Unlike Mosby's real target. The real target that night wasn't the general. The real target wasn't attractive at all. His name was Wyndham Percy Wyndham. And the great thing about Percy Wyndham is, I don't know how you do this. He had a mustache that was a foot this way and a foot that way. Go look up a picture of him. How do you do that? And so that's who the target was that night, but good for Percy. Mosby couldn't stand Percy. Good thing for Percy was that he had gone to Washington earlier that day. He was not in town that night. And so the substitute became the brigadier general, who was the youngest star in the United States Army at that time, 24 years old. And of course, the best part of this, Jones tells this story very well, but it's even better told by Mosby himself. About 30 years after the event in 1893, there was an article that Mosby wrote that was published in a magazine that's in great detail about this raid. Now you can read his report that he sent to Stuart, which is interesting. And Mosby must have been today, he's writing that report probably, he must have been so excited to be able to talk about this exploit. Who captures a brigadier general in the middle of the night? What a heist. But the thing is that I can't resist. You know, when he showed up, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. They made it, they're now 5 miles behind Union lines, 29 men. Mosby's only been in operation for about 6 weeks as a partisan unit. He's not even gotten really the rank of captain yet. And this is an experiment by Stuart at this time. It's hard to think of Mosby and all the success he's going to have as an experiment, but when they get started, 15 men from the 1st Virginia Cavalry come with Mosby to work behind federal lines. So here they are. And when they arrive in the courthouse, undetected, they go to get Wyndham. Word gets back quickly, not here, but they know exactly where the general is. And so Mosby himself will take a small detachment of 5 of his men and go to this house and pound on the door. He wants to make sure somebody hears this. And sure enough, a window rises and out pokes a head with a shirt. And who's there? And Mosby says, 5th New York Cavalry, dispatch for the general. Window goes down, they can hear footsteps coming down the stairs rapidly. The door opens, and man is grabbed by the throat with a 6-shooter. Mosby writes in this article, a 6-shooter can be very persuasive. And so, you know, and in essence, they lead him up the stairs to the general's room. Now, the general is fast asleep, snoring away. And for good reason. He had been partying the previous night with a group of women. And in fact, Mosby writes that when they came into the room, there were uncorked champagne bottles throughout the room. So very festive, enjoyable evening. There are no women in there, just the general. And Mosby goes up to his bed and rips off the quilt. The general doesn't move. And in his stupor, Mosby thinks, you know, this is going to take a bit more. And so at that point, he slaps him. And of course, this awakens the general immediately. And the general is indignant. How dare you? Who are you? And of course, he thinks it's his staff, somebody on his staff. And Mosby says, General, have you ever heard of Mosby? And the general gets very excited and said, yes, have you caught him? And Mosby's response was very subdued. No, General, I am Mosby. He has caught you. And so, of course, it's a great story, and they asked me to tell that story as part of the filming that we did. But you know what they were really interested in? They were really interested in the loot. The loot. The story goes that that night coming out of Fairfax Courthouse, Mosby brought with him, at that time, in those dollars, what amounted to $350,000 of primarily jewelry. That he brought with him. Now, I could tell you what the value of that is in today's currency, but I think it's even more fascinating to know what it really means in 1863 currency. In 1860, $350,000. In 1863, the average American annual salary is $300 a year. That's a heck of a loot. And so there's been a lot of, well, that's not possible. It is possible. It is possible because in July of 1862, now you're probably just thinking, well, this thieving Federals, the robbers, they're all a bunch of thieves. They're just stealing it from our people, stealing it from us. No, they are not. This is sanctioned by the United States government in what's known as the Confiscation Act. The Second Confiscation Act was passed by the Congress and signed by President Lincoln in 1862, in the summer of 62, July, which sanctioned federal troops to take from Confederate sympathizers anything they could take, anything. Now, this was primarily directed at enslaved. Remove the enslaved. Remove their most valuable property. That's what it mostly, but you can take anything. So it's possible that at Fairfax Courthouse that night, there was somewhere, maybe in Stoughton's headquarters, $350,000 worth of loot. That's possible. Now think about this for a moment. Mosby's men are new at partisan warfare, new at guerrilla warfare. We often think about the partisans, the guerrillas, as yes, they would, one of the lures of being a guerrilla was the opportunity to, you take your attack and you get the loot, and then you would spread the loot out amongst yourselves. It becomes yours. You don't turn it into the government. It becomes yours. And yeah, that's true. But why would Mosby want to keep something that had been stolen from his own people? I mean, that makes him a thief. And so the story is that they're leaving during that night in the darkness. They're galloping out, trying to get away. They've got the general, they've got 58 or 59 horses. That's what they really liked, horses. And they've got some prisoners. They had started with about 100 prisoners. Some of those are going to disappear in the night because Mosby's only got 29 men. So ultimately, he will arrive outside federal lines with about a third of that number. But point being that here's this loot. Now, I'm not much into jewelry, but all of us know people that have jewelry, and jewelry is not light. Gold, silver, diamonds, whatever it may be, it's not light. $350,000 worth in 1863, that's a lot of weight. And so the story goes that it was slowing them down on their escape. They weren't being chased, but Mosby was getting concerned. Daylight was coming quickly. He had to move faster. So the decision was made by Mosby to stop and bury it. To bury it. And they did. So all of it is placed in Virginia's soil. They get their bearings to where it's located so they can go back and find it again, and off they go. Well, there's no record to indicate that Mosby's men ever returned to get that $350,000 worth of stash in the ground. There's no record of it at all, anywhere. There's no mention of it anywhere, other than in our lure of what the story is. So the whole idea behind this television show is it still there? Is it still buried somewhere near Centerville or Warrenton or near Fairfax? Where the heck is it? Is it still there? Of course, off camera, I said to them, there's no way it's still there because of all the bulldozers that have walked through that area over the years. I couldn't say that on camera. But, you know, that's what I told the producer right at the beginning. There's no way it's still there. It would have been found. But that leads to the second part of the story. That perhaps they did return. They did excavate it. And then they hid it again. Then they hid it again. And that leads us to our grand finale. In Search of Mosby's Cave. Virgil Carrington Jones and Ranger Mosby, on page 240, at the end of a chapter, will describe this. He will say that in Jefferson County, along the Shenandoah River, opposite a large cliff formation on the mountain, the Blue Ridge, a federal patrol was near a burned out building just above Harper's Ferry. And suddenly, a horse collapsed into a hole. And upon further investigation, it was not a hole. It was a massive cavern right on the river. And the only way that you could find this place was by going through the river. You had to go through 3 feet of water to get to this location, opposite this vertical cliff. And upon further investigation, they discovered that this cave, this cavern, was occupied, had been used. They actually found stables, straw, for up to 200 to 300 horses in this cavern. It's near the end of the war when this is discovered. And he describes it, Jones describes it, as I just did, using the words that I've used. So I remember as a young person reading that and being very excited. Somewhere there's a cave. And I remember as a youth asking people that lived in Jefferson County that were natives of Jefferson County and natives of the Harpers Ferry area, have you ever found Mosby's Cave? And I was always disappointed because the answer was always, what are you talking about? They had heard of Mosby, and they were familiar with caves and caverns, but put the two together, Mosby and cave? What are you talking about? And so I never got an answer that was satisfactory. And the question is, does this really exist? Is it out there? Or is it part of Mosby mythology? Perhaps just like the $350,000 heist is not real, but mythology. And so, is it possible that this cave exists? Absolutely. I mean, you are familiar with the Shenandoah Valley. You're familiar with limestone. You're familiar with how limestone is a soft stone that can easily erode. You've been in New Ray Caverns, which is all about erosion of limestone. And it's big. New Ray Caverns is big. You can put 300 horses in New Ray Caverns. That's not hard. So it's very possible. And of course, it's not by itself, as you know. We have caverns in the valley. But this one, we got some clues. Jones, in that paragraph on page 240, gives us clues. Cliff, vertical cliff on the mountain, burned out building along the Shenandoah River, and a massive cavern. So where is it? Well, the best clue is it's near Harper's Ferry. That says a lot. I mean, that really condenses the Shenandoah Valley into a very small geographic area. So let's start with that. New Ray Caverns is a long way from Harper's Ferry. Now, Charlestown, as many of you know, sits right on top of a cave. They used to do, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, you could do boat tours. Go into where the old Opera House is in Charlestown, basically, and go underground, and they'd light it up for you and give you a boat tour in this massive cavern under Charlestown. It's still there. So, yeah, it's possible, certainly, that something like this exists near Harper's Ferry. Second clue, vertical cliffs. So, next time you take a raft trip on the Shenandoah and you're above Harper's Ferry, look for vertical cliffs. They exist on the Blue Ridge. They are there. So, we have two clues that are leading to a possible positive identification of this locale. The third clue, burned out building. Well, as Richard and I would know, studying Harper's Ferry history, yeah, we got burned out buildings. Now, real near Harper's Ferry, on what's known as Virginius Island, we have burned out buildings. The largest on Virginius Island was the flour mill, Harris Flour Mill, or Hearst Flour Mill. You go a little bit further upstream, there's the Rifle Works, Hall Rifle Works, which was the U.S. Rifle Works at the time of the outbreak of the Civil War. Massive burned out buildings. Is there something in that vicinity? Or here's where you've probably never been. Go further upstream. Go further upstream to a place called, doesn't exist anymore, Shenandoah City. Shenandoah City was about 2.5 miles above the confluence of the rivers on the Shenandoah. And it had its own industrial operation there. Strider was the principal name of the family that operated various industries there, including a huge flour mill. They were all burned. The Strider complex had all been burned out buildings, 2.5 miles above. And you look across the river at that point, there's a vertical cliff. So this sounds promising. 3 clues, Harper's Ferry vicinity, the cliff, burned out buildings, actually four cliff, Shenandoah River. Nobody's ever found a cave there. Somebody just said I have. So, is this an enduring mystery, this cave? Does it exist, Mosby's cave? And what about the $350,000? So let's finish this up. First on the $350,000. I want you to consider something. It is March the 8th, March the 9th. Did you know that during the Civil War, North America was in what was called a mini ice age? We were in a mini ice age. Very, very, very cold, period. It's March. The ground froze in November of 1862. I know that. I've seen that in local newspapers. So we've been through frozen ground for November, December, January, February, March. Into our 5th month of frozen ground. You all want to know what it's like to put a shovel in frozen ground? Mosby's not riding with shovels. He doesn't have any shovels with him. He doesn't even carry bayonets. He doesn't even carry sabers. Well, what are we going to bury this with? How are we going to excavate this concrete to put all this loot, a lot of it, into the ground? It physically seems impossible in many respects. Yes, it could have been there as real heist that the Federals had taken. It could have been found, and they could have taken it, but they're not going to bury it. No way they're going to bury it. So that's ridiculous. I put all that into my screenplay. Probably all that gets edited out because it doesn't fit well with unexplained mysteries. I just explained the mystery. I'm not supposed to explain the mystery. I'm supposed to advocate on its behalf. So we'll see what this looks like. Well, what about the cave itself, the cavern? Is it out there? Well, Richard, how many people roughly did serve with Mosby from 63 to 65? About 1,800 or so? Total numbers during that time period, all total rangers around 1,800. 1,800 men. All right. Now, a lot of you in here have done a lot of reading of the American Civil War. And a lot of you probably have in your libraries Mosby books, various Mosby books. I've got a lot of Mosby books. I mean, I've tried to collect everything that's been published about John Mosby as a book over the generations. And so several decades ago, to satisfy my own curiosity about this cave, I began looking at the original sources. Not Virgil Carrington Jones, he's not an original source. The people who actually were there, like Mosby himself and Mosby's men. Do they mention this cave, this cavern, anywhere? I searched and searched and searched. Nowhere is there a mention of this by any of the original characters. Now, did they take some kind of oath of secrecy to swear that they would never tell us the future about their secret cave? Some sort of fraternal brotherhood type of secret? You know, like the Masons, that we know this, but nobody else ever will. Well, that's possible. I mean, that's certainly possible. highly unlikely with 1,800 people that somebody's not going to spill it. Somebody's not going to tell you about it. Highly unlikely. But let's make the assumption that they did keep it secret. So why then, when you know something happened otherwise, do you find that the cave likely is not in existence and never was? And here's the best one of all, the best counter evidence of all to the existence of the cave. The only written reference I've seen to the cave is in Virgil Carrington Jones's book, 1944, as Richard said. Now that book's been printed over and over and over and over again. It is the most mass-produced Mosby book by far. Nothing comes close to it, nothing. Tens and tens and tens of thousands of his book and hardly 1,000 of anybody else's books. And so it's in this mass culture, this mass mental picture that this cave exists because Pat Jones tells us about it and describes it. And he actually has a reference for it. Now, there's not a whole lot of, a lot of his book doesn't have references. And this is one of the problems with journalists writing history. I'll never forget, I knew Shelby Foote pretty well. And of course, Shelby's a journalist. And I will never forget once being on a panel with Shelby and somebody asked him a question by saying, now, as a historian, Mr. Foote, and he immediately stopped the person. And he stood up and went to the microphone and said, I am not a historian. I am a storyteller. There is not a single footnote in his 3 volumes. No footnotes. Well, you can do that if you're storytelling. And so a lot of Pat Jones, when you go back and read Virgil Carrington Jones, an awful lot of it is good storytelling. Really, really, really good storytelling. No references. But he did reference this on page 240. And so I went and checked the reference. It is based upon an old woman. I'm not insulting anybody here. An old woman who told Virgil Carrington Jones that she had a newspaper article, told him, that was printed some 40 years after the war, where a federal soldier in Louisiana, carpetbagger, who's going to believe a carpetbagger, told about the discovery of this cave at Harper's Ferry 40 years after the war. That's the reference. Now, I hope you're incredulous. Otherwise, there's no hope for any of us. So I think it's a very, very dubious reference. I don't doubt that this is exactly what Virgil Carrington Jones had happened, that this woman told him about this newspaper story that was written 40 years later. I don't doubt that, but good historians would not use that as a citation. And so, does the cave exist? I think we can all agree that we have wonderful caverns and caves in our area. But the real clincher for me is after Mosby's greatest disaster. And Mosby himself would tell you that his greatest disaster of the war was the Battle of Loudon Heights in January of 1864. Terrible disaster. And Virgil Carrington Jones writes about this disaster in Ranger Mosby, just as dramatic and traumatic as every other chapter. And then you read the end of it. And what you see is Mosby's men and Mosby himself evaporate in the darkness along the Shenandoah River toward Harper's Ferry, going up the Shenandoah Valley, and the Federals in hot pursuit are following the blood prints left in the snow that January night. And then all of a sudden, the prints disappear. Well, I know, and Richard knows, and John Devine knew, and those of us who have researched the Loudon Heights fight, Mosby didn't retreat that way. Not a single Confederate went that direction. Not a one of them went that way. They came back down 671 as fast as they could. That's what they did. They didn't go up along the Shenandoah River, where the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, 1,000 men strong, was coming right at Cole's camp along the Shenandoah River. They didn't go that way. But that's where Pat Jones takes them. And so I think that we can pretty well prove, based on actual documentation, that none of Mosby's men themselves tell us about this. Mosby himself never told us about this. And then the great biographer, storyteller, who does tell us, has dubious sources, and then historically has them going the wrong direction on the night of Mosby's worst defeat. So, in search of Mosby's cave, we'll never find it. Because it doesn't exist. I'm so sorry to disappoint all of that. I'm not so sure I'm going to be in it anymore. I think, I don't have a date yet, Richard, but it'll probably be in May. I'll let you know if I get some information, if they decided to keep me. They spent a lot of money, they did, to film me, so hopefully there'll be something in there somewhere. But yeah, I'll let you know.
Okay, now hold that thought, the rest of the questions. As you know, I may not know, we don't sell tickets for these lectures, we don't charge when you come in. But we do pass the hat, or pass it with something of that sort. And I know some of you put money in the jars you came in. If you can produce your receipt for that, you don't have to. And here comes the basket.
And so while that's going around also, while you got your money out, I wanted to share this with you. Some of you may have this, but I bet most of you don't. This is a book that I had the privilege of researching and writing called Harper's Ferry Under Fire. And this won a National Book of the Year award back in 2012. If you really want to, Harper's Ferry is an incredible story during the American Civil War, but that story really had not been told except by interpreters at Harper's Ferry. And so this attempts to take that story and put it into an opportunity for you to take it home so that you can share it with yourself. And so this book was published by the Harper's Ferry Park Association, which is the nonprofit organization that supports Harper's Ferry National Park. So all the proceeds go to them, and it usually costs about $25, but today you can get this one and this one, Antietam Revealed, which is another book that I had the privilege of writing. Two books together are close to $50, but you can get it today for $20 if anybody's interested, $20. So that's a pretty good deal, and I'd be happy to, I'd be honored if any of you had an interest in taking Harper's Ferry home with you through Harper's Ferry Under Fire. I guarantee you, you will learn a lot that you don't know, because when I was writing this book, I learned a lot I didn't know. So I'd be honored if anyone's interested.
Take questions on that?
Yeah,
Questions, please stand and speak louder than you. Ask the question.
Well, let me go with the question.
I'll repeat the question.
Okay, to look at the geologists show the limestone cracks. If the limestone cracks doesn't exist in that cliff areas that we looked at, then it isn't gonna be a cave there.
Thank you. Yeah, and you know, that's another thing too, is that, well, that's not really a question as much as it was a comment. I mean, talking geology. I don't talk geology, but, the USGS did not exist at the time of the Civil War. The United States Geological Survey, I think, came into existence in 1869, I believe. So it's been around a long time. And of course, that's plenty of time for the United States Geological Survey to figure out where are the caves? Where are these things? And so, you know, there's a lot of good scientific information on the caves that are in our area. And then, of course, we have, that doesn't mean they've been explored, however. They may have been identified, their locations have been identified. I know we have in the room some spelunkers, cavers, who explore these caves, who've been in some of these caves. And, you know, most of these caves are on private property. Most caves are not on public property. I mean, Luray Caverns is private. Shenandoah Caverns is private. All the commercial caves are private. Mammoth Cave is a national park, but most of them are private operations. I will tell you that a cave was discovered at Harper's Ferry in the 1880s. A large cavern was discovered at Harper's Ferry. Massive. Now it's located still, it's there. It's in the national park today. And it's about almost 2 miles, a little bit, about 2 miles from the confluence. And you're saying, well, Dennis, you just said this doesn't exist. The trouble is, this particular cave is on the wrong river. It's not on the Shenandoah River. It's on the Potomac River. It's up near Bakerton. And so it's a big cave, and it was commercial at one time. Some of you might remember some of you might remember a fellow named Dixie Kelly. Dixie was the proprietor of the Hilltop House Hotel. He bought it just before the 100th anniversary of John Brown, and he owned it all the way up until 1988. So Dixie owned the Hilltop House for over 30 years. Dixie bought all this area where this cave was and made it into a campground. It was a Jellystone campground in the 1970s, Jellystone campground. But he then opened up the cave for commercial purposes, known as the Harper's Ferry Caverns. And so I remember as a young ranger directing people to the Harper's Ferry Caverns when Dixie owned it. And Dixie closed it in the early 1980s, so it wasn't open very long. But there was a large cavern discovered at Harper's Ferry in the 1880s. But it wasn't anywhere near the vicinity that this theoretical Mosby cave was. Yes, sir.
I live down at Lovettsville Road, wild caves down there. Maybe this summer or the spring, I'll take a peek. My question more is, I've heard a rumor.
Better to do it in wintertime than stay summer.
Well, there's actually a train in one of the caves that's now submerged. So I've heard reference to that. But my question really, so I've heard reference from it to cannons being buried in the Centerville, Chantilly area with gold in it, that the Confederates as part of the retreat didn't want to bring gold with them, so buried it so that the Union troops would find it. Have you ever heard of that myth or have any reference to that?
So the question dealing with artillery and gold buried somewhere in the Centerville area. So we know that the Confederates occupy that area. There's fortifications in that area. They're there for an extended period of time in 61, 62. Before Johnston withdraws the army down towards the peninsula and Richmond. So it's possible, certainly because of their occupation. But let me tell you something. Who leaves gold behind? And then even more importantly for an army, who leaves cannon behind? You don't leave artillery behind. Unless it's siege artillery, and you can't move it. But even then, and there was no forced occupation during that time. I mean, they weren't under pressure to move. And so they would have taken everything out of there. This reminds me of a tale of Maryland Heights and Harper's Ferry. The Maryland Heights is the highest of the mountains that overlook Harper's Ferry. During the Gettysburg campaign, Lee's moving north and Lee bypasses Harper's Ferry. So now the Confederates are north of Harper's Ferry and the Federal Army says, oh, we got a problem here. We got to get out of here. And so there was on top of the mountain, a gun that weighed 9,600 pounds, just the tube. It was a 9-inch Dahlgren naval gun that they had taken up there in the fall of 1862. So the theory is that because they were under duress and they were trying to move quickly, and because they were they had horrible weather, that instead of trying to move that gun, they spiked it and then threw it down over the edge of the mountain. And it's still there. How in the world do you hide a 9,600-pound tube of iron that goes rolling down a mountainside? I mean, somebody would have found that. I mean, with a metal detector, you'd go deaf. It's not there. It's not there. So I suspect it's probably, again, it's a great tale, and that's probably exactly what it is. Yes, sir.
The report that Lovett's submitted to Stuart, was there any mention of the treasure? Did the treasure itself exist or not? Very mention of that at all?
No, there's no mention of the treasure. Now, there is one word in that report. Well, actually, it's not in the report. It's in Mosby's article in 1893. And he talks about spoils. Spoils. Now, spoils is a word for treasure. So possibly they did remove some things. I have no doubt that in the general's headquarters that night, they discovered things that didn't belong to the general. I have no doubt. They would have taken that. Absolutely, that'd be spoils. They could have put that in the pockets. They could have put that in saddlebags. That would be easy to remove. And then, for example, Wyndham's headquarters, they went to Wyndham's headquarters. Now they took his clothing, but they also took personal belongings, like, that he might have left behind because he had gone to Washington. So let's say he had he had a couple of gold watches. He doesn't need 3 or 4 on him. He leaves 3 behind. He takes 1 with him. They would take that. That would be spoils. So even though you see that word used, I think that would be a stretch to say this represents that loot of that $350,000 or even any part of it that supposedly was buried as they were trying to escape. But he does use the word spoils. Yes, ma'am?
Why would they have that large amount of money?
Not money. It wouldn't have been money. It would have been what it was worth. And so again, jewelry, fine jewelry that could have been and likely was confiscated as part of the Second Confiscation Act. I mean, the idea was to make these people poor. The idea was to make you poor, make Virginia poor, make you pay. So we'll just take what you have that makes you wealthy or makes you what we would call middle class. We'll just take it. If you're a slave owner, we'll take it. This is sanctioning you as a federal private to literally go to any property in Loudoun County and just take it. The only thing you can't take is the ground itself because you can't move the ground. But anything else you can take. And so by law, federal law, the idea was to impoverish economically the Confederacy as a whole through the Confiscation Act. It was brilliant. It was a brilliant piece of legislation. That was one way you can destroy an enemy is through economic warfare. And so That's what it was. And so it's very possible that a lot of this had accumulated at Fairfax Courthouse. It's possible it was there, as jewelry especially, valuables, but not money. And Confederate money was, even in 1863, especially by 1863, was pretty worthless because they didn't have anything back, inflation, et cetera. When the war broke out, you could buy a real quality horse, a great horse at the outbreak of the war for $120, which was a lot of money. Think about that. That's 1/3 of a person's yearly salary to have a real quality horse, $120. By 1863, that same horse was $1,200. And that's the reason that Mosby, most of the time, was after horses. Most of the time, he was seeking horses. Yes, sir.
How many men rode Mosby? And, how many supposedly were in this cave? And is there any record from any of them about this cave?
The Mosby's numbers vary depending upon what type of military action he was going to engage in. I think that probably the largest number that he would ever mass would be about 400. The Berryville Wagon Train raid, for example, in August of 1864, he had about 400 men with him. That was big. That was a massive number of men accumulated for Mosby at that time. But typically, or this time of the war in 1863, he's operating with less than 50. And as his command grows, it wasn't unusual for him to operate with less than 150. So, I mean, the whole idea behind guerrilla warfare is you don't want to get caught. So you want to strike quickly, you want to surprise the enemy, and every time your numbers go up, your chances of success go down. With regard to mention the cave, as I mentioned, I've seen it nowhere in any published material. I've never seen it mentioned by any of Mosby's men. None of the contemporaries say anything about it. Mosby himself doesn't mention it. I can tell you where they went. You all know this. I'll tell you where they didn't go to a cave. They went to the mountain. They went to the Blue Ridge. That's where they went. That was their shelter. That was their cave. And if any of you have ever hiked the Appalachian Trail in Loudoun County or Faulkner County, oh, it gives me chills just mentioning it. I mean, there's a thing called the roller coaster on the Appalachian Trail. I love the roller coaster. Love it. I love going up and down those hills on the roller coaster. That is Mosby country. That is the heart of their seclusion. When you're going up and down that roller coaster, everything that Mosby and his men needed to survive is in the roller coaster. What did they need? They needed shelter. There are plenty of opportunities for shelter. They need water, lots of it, lots of it. The amount of water that you see in the springs, and they needed basically one way in, one way out. Well, when you look at these ravines in the roller coaster, that's in essence what they are. They're these massive, deep ravines that are cut into the mountain. There's only one way to get in there. That's what you want. Because if the enemy came in after you, the enemy's not getting back out. And so you could survive in there. You could hide in there. You could have water in there. You could put your horses in there. You could bring straw and hay in there. Everything you need is in the mountain. Everything. And the Blue Ridge was their shelter. The Blue Ridge was in essence their cave. And that's what Mosby's been talking about. When you read their original sources, as Richard has, they all talk about the mountains as their shelter, their refuge. That's where they would go. During the Great Burning here in Loudoun County, November 28th, December 2nd of 1864, very few of Mosby's men, I mean, the whole purpose of that was to hurt you because you're supporting Mosby's guerrillas, but it was mostly to capture them and wipe them out. They were terrible failure. Terrible failure. In that regard, they only got a couple dozen men and horses. out of a command of 1,800. And, where were they? They're in the mountains. And the federal army was not going into those mountains because they knew they would become extinct if they went in there. So, that really was their principal shelter. Yeah, final question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, how many men did Mosby have in the Battle of Loudon Heights?
Well, that was a fairly sizable force, and it was two forces. He had two, that's what we would today in modern military warfare refer to as a pincer movement. It's a pincer movement. What Mosby was doing at Loudon Heights was pretty brilliant. Now, where is Cole's camp? Cole's camp's right along Route 671. So, if you're on 340, I saw somebody here with a brewery a little earlier. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. If you're on 340 and you go up there, the ravine right by the brewery, that's the ravine they went up to get to the camp. And so they're coming from two different directions. They're coming north on 671 from between the hills. All right. They're coming north. So the Federals can't escape to the south. And then Stringfellow, who was a special guide with the 4th Virginia Cavalry, who worked with Mosby as a scout, was leading another detachment that was going around the nose of Short Hill. And that road's still there today. Some of you probably are very familiar with that old road that was built in the 1780s that runs along the nose of Short Hill. Most of it's in the national park today. And so the idea was we're gonna hit them from the north and hit them from the south. So it was Stringfellow's force that was coming in along the river, the Potomac, along Short Hill, and would climb up that ravine. And so the idea was we're going to sandwich them in between and we're going to nail them all. And it would have worked. It would have worked, except somebody got trigger happy and the signal went off before the signal was scheduled and everybody was in place, and that created nothing but chaos. And Cole's men ultimately escaped and created quite a disaster for Mosby and his men. But that's the total number on that was a pretty sizable force. He had close to 200 with him that night, I think, didn't he? Yeah, that was a pretty big force. Well, I said that was the last question, and that is the last answer. Thank you all very much for your hospitality coming out on a Sunday afternoon. Thank you.